but also great session, great conversation about to happen. I know both these gentlemen, and I know it's going to be a wonderful time. We're talking about continuous integration and continuous delivery, which we just learned is not CD-ROM or cookie cocoa dispenser. So I think they'll teach you a little bit about CD and CI/CD, as they say it. Bryan Guinn from CloudBees and Anton Hoffman from Harness. The floor is yours. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Looking forward to this conversation today. Wrap up the great day we've had. It's been a great event. We're really looking forward to presenting this content. So definitely got a good amount of time for Q&A today. To kind of kick us off, a little bit of background on me. So Bryan Guinn, I've been in the technology industry for over 20 years. I really focus a lot on now on Air Force's Space Force. I've been into cloud, big Office 365 migration workloads back in the day. Did a lot of security work in the cyber front around application security, and then more recently DevOps. Fortunate enough to get to speak on all those topics every year as I'm doing today, so really appreciate that. And I volunteer for a number of different organizations to give back to the community, including working with the local AFCEA chapter on some emerging leaders events that we do around mentoring young folks that are coming into the workforce. So really excited again to speak with you today and learn more. Anton?
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. No, it's late in the day, but really appreciate your time here. So I lead Harness's Air Force, Space Force, Combatant Command, and Systems Integrator business. Been here for about a year. Before this was at a few other companies, so Sneak, MongoDB, PTC, and Dell EMC, all focused on federal, mostly defense customers. I come out of the Marine Corps myself. I was in the Marines back in 2006 to 2012. Started in the infantry, worked my way up, became a recon man, became a South sniper, deployed to Iraq, deployed to Afghanistan, got out, went back to school, got my MBA, got a master's in professional studies at UConn, focused on cybersecurity. So really fortunate for that, and really thankful for the opportunity to chat today. So before we kick it off, right, and obviously the topic today is CI/CD. We're going to talk about kind of best practices. We're going to talk about considerations and things like that that you should be thinking about. But before we go into any of that, the nuts and bolts, it's super important just to understand like why organizations even adopt CI/CD as a strategy, right? It's really to accelerate software delivery, software deployment, right? So that you can deploy at the speed of mission, speed of need, speed of requirement, without having to cut corners and sacrifice things like quality, security, efficiency, control, et cetera, right? You want to bring those components into delivery. That is having a good, robust delivery practice. There's really nothing worse than, hearing from the warfighter, the end user, and they say, hey, we have this requirement, we have this need, and the organization says, well, fantastic, we'll get it to you in a year, right? That's not really, number one, helping the mission or the warfighter. And number two, it's really exercising a terrible delivery practice. So how do we deploy faster, but also how do we deploy in a more secure way, a more efficient way? So I have a quick story to kind of illustrate this, but the founder of Harness is a guy named Joe T. Bensall. And before he came to Harness, he was at a company called App Dynamics. So AppD is a app performance monitoring company, and it's now owned by Cisco. But back in like 2014, 2015 timeframe, Joe T was having a pretty major challenge. And his challenge was he could not innovate fast enough. He wanted to release new features, new updates to his users like every single day. And so he said to his engineers, hey, we want to deploy faster. And he said, I want to deploy new features, new updates every day, multiple times a day, because that is what's going to allow us to really accelerate and compete effectively. And his engineering team said, hey, we can't move that fast. And so light bulb went off, and Joe T said, wow, this is pretty interesting. Like, why is that the case? And he started hearing the same thing from other App Dynamics customers. They were like, we can't deliver and deploy that fast. So he went back and he said, what's the cause? What's the reason? And it turned out that the delivery environment was incredibly brittle. It could not scale. They simply could not get code shipped fast enough. And so second light bulb went off for him, and he said, hey, when I make an exit from App Dynamics, which he did, sold it to Cisco for $4 billion. He said, I'm going to go into CD, and I'm actually going to bring two things to the fight. I'm going to fully automate these pipelines, and I'm going to bring AI ML. And that was his opinion on how he could help and solve for better delivery. But zooming out from that story, a lot of organizations struggled to create good, robust delivery environments, and they simply didn't have a good CI/CD strategy in place. They did not have a good strategy. They did not have a good practice. And that's effectively what we're going to talk about today, and some considerations for that. So we'll go next slide. So when we talk about CI/CD, right, and we just kind of step back and really look at the key components, this is a high level abstraction or representation of a CI/CD pipeline, right? They're the modern building blocks that you bring together to create a pipeline. So CI is really code to artifact, right? It's that first phase, code to artifact. And CD, again, delineating these two, is really artifact forward to end customer, end user, or in our case, the warfighter. So code to artifact, what happens during this phase? A lot of coding, a lot of testing, and a lot of merging into ultimately a deployable artifact. Like, that's the thing that the end user can get the most value from, get the most benefit from. So if it took you, or it took developer team, a day or a couple days to create a deployable artifact, the next logical thing they want to do is deploy it, right? They want to get it in the hands of users. But that's really where the complexity, the bulk of the complexity in CI/CD comes into play, because you have to think about your cloud and your infrastructure, your provisioning, change management, release strategy, verification, and APM, feature management, rollback strategy, reporting, secrets, security, auditing, compliance. Like, these are all components that you have to consider, and you have to think about how you're actually bringing them together. Bryan, have you hit the build? A lot of organizations will say, hey, we're going to go ahead and, try to bring all these components together with scripts, right? We're going to try to connect all of these things with additional layers of code. And ultimately, like, that may not be a good consideration in certain situations because it's slow, it's costly, it's brittle, it's unreliable, right? Scripting, manual coding on top of your pipeline is, number one, not value added to the end user. They don't care what your pipeline looks like. They don't care what kind of Python scripts you wrote to create that pipeline. They just care that they have a good user experience. They have a good application. They have a good piece of software that they can get value from. So these are all kind of individual points of failure that you should be considering and should be understanding. Scripting and a manual process may not necessarily be a good choice for your particular use case. Next slide. So common challenges, right? The first basic challenge in software delivery is, how do I deploy faster, right? How do I deploy at the speed of mission, speed of need? And, some of the ways that you can do that is by automating where necessary, right? Do I have to script all these components together? Can I take advantage of automation? Can I reduce developer toil or, manual work that can otherwise be automated? Can I use templates? Can I use, reusable pipelines for speed, for scale? These are all considerations to help kind of address application velocity and deployment velocity. Now, the second component that organizations often struggle with is governance, right? So here we're really talking about standardizing your deployments, developing an SOP, and strengthening how you're actually bringing forth DevSecOps, like how you're actually, creating that practice and making it robust. The other two components that you want to consider here are auditing and compliance. You want to know everybody that touches that pipeline, what they do, when they did it. You want to have a very granular understanding of that, because that's the lifeblood of pretty much everything you're coding and building. And the last piece is zero trust. So components of zero trust that kind of overlay in the CI/CD that you should be thinking about: RBAC, SSO, and secrets management. Third piece is quality, right? And here we're talking about deployment quality. So when you go to production, you want to have confidence that nothing's going to break. You're not going to have any sort of downtime. And if you do have some sort of downtime, do you have a strategy to recover, to restore? How can you decrease that amount of downtime? How can you decrease feature regressions? These are all components of good quality. Now, logically, you're probably going to say, okay, great. I understand, the pillars of good deployment, quality, and health. How do I actually measure that? Bryan's going to touch on this more, but just to bring this forth is really DORA metrics. And there's 4 DORA metrics that are kind of the industry standard for good deployment, quality, and health. The first is, how often do you deploy? The second is the lead time for change, or how long does it take to go from code committed into production. The third is time to recover or restore, MTTR. How long does that take? And the last is your change failure rate. What percentage of code changes that you make actually result in failures in production? So the book Accelerate really coined these DORA metrics, and they're really, like I said, an industry standard that you can use to benchmark where you are today and where you want to go in the future. Accelerate also does a pretty good job of helping organizations understand, like, okay, what's a low performing organization versus a high performing organization? Where do I fit in that continuum, and how can I set targets to actually produce, meaningful improvements? Just for kind of size and scale, they outline, a low performing org as, we deploy monthly and our lead time for change is weekly or monthly, and our MTTR is about a week or longer, and 30 to 50% of our changes lead to failures in production. That's like the low end. And then on the high end, you're talking about deploying on demand multiple times a day, taking about an hour for code committed into production, restoring in about an hour or less, and then 0 to 10% of your code changes lead to failures in prod. So there you can see kind of the continuum. I would say in many cases in defense, there's often a lot of constraints where perhaps you can't deploy every single day. But what organizations should be thinking about here is, how do I deploy faster with better governance? How do I measure that performance? If you're deploying once a year, I would say perhaps that's too infrequent, right? Maybe there's ways to deploy quarterly or biannually, but these are ways you can set targets and use DORA metrics to help improve that. The last piece is efficiency and scale, right? So how are we leveraging developers in the organization? How are we making sure that they are the most productive that they can be? I would say in organizations today that are super, super reliant on good software, which is pretty much every org, commercial side, government side, software is like the backbone. We want to make sure that they're spending their time doing meaningful work, building fantastic apps that benefit the mission, benefit the end user. Quick kind of, a statistic to kind of park in the back of your mind. Joe T, the founder of Harness, he went out and he pulsed his network and he said, all the developers out there who know me, how much time do you actually spend building awesome software? And 550 people responded. So I'm going to take that as statistically significant. And 80% said we spend no more than 4 hours a day building awesome software, right? So 4 hours a day, that's half their day. Extrapolate that. Half their day, half their week, half their month, half their year is spent building awesome software. What's the other half of their time spent doing? It's trying to get that artifact into production. This is why having a good, robust CI/CD practice and environment that's automated as much as possible is super, super important. The next consideration here, efficiency and scale, is how do I decrease the number of tools, right? How do I reduce tool chain sprawl, consolidate where I can? This is a way that you can address that. And then lastly, in the post-production environment, right? How do I optimize my infrastructure? How do I reduce spend? How do I right-size infrastructure where I can? That's really the fine-tuning that you should be thinking about in terms of efficiency and scale.
Perfect. Thanks. Those are all great points, and they definitely have some more information and data to really kind of just piggyback and back that up. So what I wanted to talk about was really kind of like, how do you go about kind of extending what Anton was talking about as far as, automating that release process, right? So when we think about it, really teams should have a demonstratable, predictable, and repeatable method for release automation that governs the process and the configuration of those software deployments. So when we think about it, CI is really about speed, right? How quickly can I get artifacts built? CD and really the practice around release orchestration starts to aim for repeatability to ensure the worthiness of the software and that it's getting where it needs to go. So I use an example, right? So if you think of CI as analogous to the conveyor belt, rapidly producing widgets, continuous delivery and release orchestration really picks up those widgets, validates that they were built properly, ensures they don't conflict with other widgets, puts them in the right boxes, put those boxes on the right trucks, and drive those trucks out to the right destination, right? To make sure that it's getting delivered successfully for that mission owner, that application owner. So when you think of it that way, I start to think that continuous delivery and release orchestration is perhaps really the most unsung discipline within software delivery, despite its profound importance, right? We talk a lot about CI and CD, but not really how do we actually releasing those components? Are they just deployable, or actually can we deliver them? And so actually, there was a group of folks, including Brian Finster, who spoke this morning about this, and Tracy Bannon, who started minimumcd.org because they believed that a minimal definition of continuous delivery was really required to improve the flow and delivery and achieve the outcomes that you kind of see here on the screen. I think it's important to note that, you can go on the site. I highly recommend it. I know it's been talked about several times today, but definitely go check it out. Dave Farley, the author most noted for continuous delivery, reliable software releases through build, test, and deployment automation, actually added his signature to that project, which to me just kind of reinforces the core concepts there. I've actually added mine as well. It's real easy. You just go do a pull request. Diving in a little bit deeper on that, right? Only by implementing those core practices can we really start to see the benefits of continuous delivery. And so there's some minimums that they outline. I'll cover a little bit. So, first minimum activity for CD is really, you've got to use continuous integration, right? And kind of the definition that they came up with, which again, I think is a great starting place, which is kind of where we're at, right? Where do we start to build these building blocks and start to improve the speed at which I can get software to a warfighter? Means we got to start with trunk-based development, meaning really all the changes have to get integrated into that trunk. So they originate from the trunk, they reintegrate into the trunk, and they're short-lived, and often, they need to be removed after the merge. That work has to integrate into that trunk really daily. I mean, at least be able to, recognizing that we may have longer cycles in the government, but whenever we can, we want to integrate that as often as possible. And then that we also want to make sure that there's automated testing happening before that merge to the trunk takes place. So this way the work is tested with other work automatically at the time of merge, so we can start to identify when we're going to have problems, right? So that we're not pushing a feature that's going to break something else. And that, look, if we run into a problem and a feature, and all feature work stops when the build is read, right? If there's a problem with the build, we have to stop. There's no reason to continue pushing this, risking potentially breaking something else within our application. And really that new work does not break already delivered work, right? So again, I want to make sure that I'm not pushing something new that's going to break something that we already have there. And through this automated testing, we can start to identify a lot of when that's going to occur. So again, when we start thinking about what are some of these minimum things we would need to do if we're really doing CD, is one, we talked about using continuous integration, but we also want to make sure that that application pipeline we have is the only way to deploy into any environment. So we want that consistency. We want to make sure that the pipeline is able to decide the releasability of the changes and that its verdict is definitive, right? So that we've structured that, built the pipelines in a way that we can now trust the systems to know if this is good, functional or not, and then can help inform us during that process. And then we want to make sure that artifacts that are created by the pipeline always meet the organization's definition of deployable. Whether or not we're going to actually deploy it, we need to determine what our definition of deployable is for our organization, and then make sure that the artifacts coming out of there meet that requirement. We need to make sure that there's no human changes after a commit, right? So these need to be immutable artifacts. Again, we talked about, stop feature work when the pipeline goes red. If we've got a problem with the pipeline, we need to stop. And we really need, I see this often, customers kind of struggle to maintain this, but there's a couple different ways they can, which is making sure that they have a production-like test environment, because that's really the only way that you're going to know if, in fact, these features that you're pushing are going to break. I think it's important to have the ability to roll back on demand. So if there is a problem, you see that happening a lot more nowadays with being able to use feature flagging and feature management type techniques to be able to accomplish some of that rollback as well. And that we always have our application configuration deploying with those artifacts. So again, that's just kind of a high level outline of some of the key pieces that are pointed out. But again, learn more at minimumcd.org. It's a great resource. Now, when we think about why this is important, for government programs with the substantial software delivery and scope, they should have teams focused exclusively on accomplishing continuous delivery and release orchestration. The kind of automation needed to reduce that long-term O&M on programs. Doesn't really happen as much as we'd like at the task or the Scrum team level, but it's really necessary to help. A lot of times we see islands of automation. The downside with that is as that program grows, this kind of sprawled, disconnected team starts to balloon the cost and kind of starts to threaten the governance benefits. And that's kind of Anton's point about reducing the size of that tool chain, right? How can you start to minimize that to make sure you're really being smart about what you're allowing people to do? And how can you kind of add on to that layer of governance as well? And that's really where we start to look at, how do we leverage release orchestration to accomplish that? So there are kind of several elements of effective continuous delivery release orchestration that we look at. Pre-built release templates where automated, customized approval gates control the pipeline. Again, so if we know something's wrong, we can stop it. And ensuring that each state is reviewed by the appropriate channel before proceeding. And channel, not necessarily a human operator, but again, having the pipeline be able to go in there and analyze this to make sure that we're pushing good quality code into production. The use of things like self-service templates of standardized environments and pipeline types that are accessible to each of the teams that are out there and its respective release environment. So the different environment types I'm going to deploy to are going to probably change what those standard self-service templates do based on languages, cloud hosted, on-prem. And then each of these operational environments should get a template that the development teams can use, ensuring that we can transition to operation successfully each time. So with that, you have your developers working with a connected tool chain, should only use immutable objects, which allows the pipeline to become a single point for configuration control and an easy to follow audit trail. And then our developers and our release managers can now easily be able to produce reports for the most common types of audit requests, right? What's the duration of our builds look like? How many delays in a given release did we run into? Or an accounting of all the manual interactions with the release, so we can start to, again, look for some of those additional efficiencies that we can find. So these managers should be able to, these team lead managers should be able to go in there and quickly see the status of the releases across all the programs, kind of rolling all this insight up. So they should have the insight and control over the releases, along with different ways to enforce the corporate, the governance policies they have, security and compliance requirements. And that's where kind of having an agnostic CDRO tool that can automate and orchestrate these complex software releases, different pipelines and deployments coming from different tools in the front end. Kind of think of CDRO tool being agnostic in the sense that it doesn't really care as much which CI tool it's going to get. We see that a lot on the corporate side of the world because of acquisition. Companies go out, they acquire other companies. One group was using, a certain type of Git repo and CI tool on the front end, but then you go to another one and they're using a different one. Ultimately going to merge all this together. And do we need to start changing the way that those teams have built their tooling? Not necessarily, because CDRO can actually help pull those pieces together, provide that insight across that. And we'll get into that a little bit more when I talk about kind of metrics and value stream. But again, I really see CDRO as a critical enabler of modern software delivery, since its automation can accommodate things like person-in-the-loop control gates and testing outside of that CI process to kind of help inform that whole release. And I think without it, the release process starts to lack that rigor, consistency, and governance, which starts to make kind of the management of it a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult. So let's talk about metrics and value stream a bit. So when we think about this, there's key performance indicators, management insights that let program leadership track progress and make sense of software releases in a consistent, reliable, and repeatable way. And they don't just design themselves on the fly. So fortunately, Dora, as Anton mentioned earlier, has articulated the 4 key metrics, like you said: mean lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to recover, and the change failure rate. And these are great, right? These are a starting place to start metrics to start assessing throughput, developer productivity, reliability, which together kind of overall illustrate the performance of the development teams. In one of the state of DevOps reports, which is where they go and actually pull these metrics to kind of figure out where organizations fall, Dora found that the highest performing organizations achieve remarkable results, often 46 times more frequent code deployment, 440 times faster lead time from commit to deploy, 96 times faster mean time to recover from downtimes, and a 5 times lower change failure rate, which is pretty significant, right? And these are top performers, but again, they're driving a lot of value to their end users and being able to deliver this software in a much faster, much more effective manner. So when we start to think beyond just metrics, and I'll say, Dora is a great place to start. As you mature your program, you start looking at flow metrics, which are around flow efficiency, to really help drive an understanding of where can you actually maximize that throughput of the pipelines to drive that development even faster. But again, as a starting place, Dora is a great place to get started with. So when we start to think about this, value streams are kind of the steps that an organization takes to provide a continuous flow of value to its customers. So the end users that are going to consume this. And the goal underpinning value stream management is to optimize software delivery by revealing where blockages and waste occur, right? Like at a high level, like that's what we're trying to identify. So this starts to become especially important in large, complex programs where waste can disappear into day-to-day activities. I mean, think about the survey results that Anton mentioned earlier. You have, half of your developers' time basically being wasted, right? And this would help identify where those wastes are. So we know a lot of the waste occurs because of handoffs or wait time, and usually between individuals and teams. We're having to wait for tools to process, or we're having to wait for someone to look at something. And those inefficient handoffs lead to that low productivity and poor quality. And they also start to inflate the cost of the delay, because now we've got these inefficiencies. It slows things down. I'm not driving that value. My developers aren't as efficient. However, if we can start to monitor performance using this value stream management approach, we can start to align the entire organization around the goal of delivering this value. And so now we have everyone from security to operations all bought into this method and this approach. And this is where software delivery metrics come in many shapes and sizes. Again, we've talked a lot today in the DevOps world. They're really guided by Dora, Flow, and or we see some ISO standards as well, kind of driving that. I think a best practice is to really track value streams and metrics at both the programs and individual team levels, so that you get more insight to what's happening across the stack. Now, I'll say this, because with any metric, right, you have to be very careful just to have numbers just for the sake of numbers. Metrics are worthless if they're not used to create improvement, right? They're not here to bash on teams or get after people because we don't feel like they're performing at the top tier that, that maybe Dora says an organization can achieve. They're there to help enhance the value streams that your organization is dealing with. And based on organizational constraints, you may or may not be able to become a highest performer, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't improve incrementally. And allowing you, really managing these value streams does let you focus on how do I deliver more value to my customer, my end user who's going to consume these applications. To do this, this is where we really need to start connecting multiple teams and tools, processes, pulling all of these pieces together in the applications to start to gain that clear visibility and insight into how the value is flowing through that whole software delivery process. And so often this means, usually having a platform that can scale easily, enables collaboration, helps reduce risk alongside with accessing real-time data on those performance of those DevOps teams, both tracking their throughput and their stability. So why is this important? It's important because value stream management, sensible metrics enable software organizations developing software to gauge the performance and improve those improvements that they make. They gain real-time performance data to benchmark and track performance based on industry standard indicators related to throughput. We talked about with Dora metrics, throughput being deployment frequency, mean lead time, and then stability, really mean time to recover and that change failure rate. And these can help solve a few different challenges, right? Poor visibility across the software delivery process, which makes it difficult to measure and manage our performance of our DevOps pipelines and teams. And it makes it hard to identify improvement areas, leverage best practices, and really support the collaboration across those teams. So there's no connection between the applications, the teams, and the tools means that it's intensive, it's more error prone. The methods of collecting static data for measuring and managing the organization's continuous delivery capabilities are not really going to give us all the insight we need. And that lack of information to track the flow of value from the time it's an idea to production, and guesswork on identifying where those bottlenecks are, where the wait times start to lead to increased waste and delays in delivering that value. Basically, without insights into the value stream, teams have no clear path to increase their DevOps maturity or modernize and optimize its way of building and delivering software for the organization and stakeholders. And why are we doing all this, right? I mean, it really comes down to IT, kind of IT modernization, digital transformation. It's the thought of modernizing is really the key to reaping the full long-term value and benefits of running your applications and IT infrastructure really towards a cloud type model, right? That means continuous evaluation of your applications, the infrastructure, and the services to ensure that they're optimized to achieve your mission and business goals. So continuous modernization results in limited technical debt, and the focus shifts from maintaining what you have to delivering value to your end users, to the warfighter. So why is this important? I mean, it's important because today programs are looking at ways to help increase the speed at which they can modernize while still having that kind of guide railed approach, the governance pieces that need to be in place. And that's where they start to struggle. Almost always this occurs because the programs lack the expertise, which is why you're here today learning, right? If you don't have the expertise yourself, but also because of resources are trying to achieve those modernization goals. And a lot of those goals can be helped through automation, right? The more we can automate, the more we can audit, the more insights we have into the process, and the more we can start to reduce the amount of manual effort or labor that's required to do things. And then this allows us to really mature our solutions and adopt new technologies. So this creates a demand for solutions that can start to support like modern container or Kubernetes type strategies alongside traditional mainframe modernization strategies. The mainframes aren't going anywhere in a lot of organizations. Definitely, this kind of brings us to a point where there's a lot of opportunity here. These solutions aren't really a one size fits all. It's about the organization agreeing on what their goals are, how quickly can they move, and then taking incremental steps toward improving it using some of the tips and the techniques that we laid out today. So with that, I will turn it back over to Anton if you had anything else, or if not, we've got plenty of time for some Q&A.
No, all good for Q&A. Thanks.
Excellent. Have you guys already answered some of the questions that popped up? Oh, looks like you did. Or Anton, you answered it in the text. You mind kind of talking about your example for those that maybe can't see the text?
Yeah, so long and short of it is continuous deploy. You deploy every single time a change is made. Continuous delivery doesn't mean that you deploy every single time, but that you effectively could. I think effectively most people are on the continuous delivery side. Very few are continuous deploy. I don't know. That's my experience, Brian. I don't know if you have a different thought on that.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's to what you said, right? Continuous deploy means it would do it every time a change is made. That's a pretty tall ask, especially in the government space. But again, having that continuous delivery means that those artifacts are deployable if I wanted to. If we needed to push them, we could. It doesn't mean that we might not roll a bunch of them together and then deliver once a quarter, once every 6 months. But the fact that they are deployable if you needed to is really the key piece there. And it's a good question to delineate the two, because I often hear people get those two mixed up.
Definitely. Thank you. And thanks for expounding on that. Another question here, but I'll just throw out there. We do have time. If anyone wants to turn their audio or camera on, just raise your hand. I'll invite you over to a panelist. You can ask directly. But a question here from Evan is probably more of a contracting question, but it is beyond just the agile contracting topic alone. Oh, sorry. He's talking about above. I didn't see your above question, Evan. End of day for me too, apparently. One of the biggest challenges I see out here there's a company, ZZZ, who develops and delivers GOT software to multiple U.S. federal customers. Any strategies to work towards moving them to a government-owned development environment? You stumped him.
No, I was just making sure I understood the question. Yeah, I mean, we do. I mean, I think that's just like, let's talk about software factories, right? Or innovation hubs. I mean, that's kind of what those are. They're government-owned development environments, be it, Platform One from, Iron Bank, or Party Bus perspective, where you can go and consume, pre-built configured pipelines that have even a continuous ATO attached to them, or the other software factories. We're part of one down in outside of Eglin Air Force Base, Rogue One, which is really more of an innovation hub, but really driving that ability to offer continuous delivery pipelines that are pre-approved by an AO. That allows them to go in and start prototyping on software right away and release it onto some networks that they have, provides a lot of efficiencies. But I mean, I think the software factory ecosystem is really those government-owned dev environments today.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it starts with kind of finding the organization that's really going to sponsor, right, said pipeline, whether it's, hey, you're going to platform one, you're going to one of the software factories. I know for us, like the SWAGs are pretty big. So at the SWAG level, they're pretty much able to leverage and create their own pipeline that they can reuse in multiple places throughout the SWAG. So that sometimes, lays foundation for reciprocity and for other organizations to attach. So yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions? Nobody's raised their hand. No one wants to come on screen. I'll ask one. How you guys talked about a lot of what they are: continuous integration, continuous delivery. But what are ways that just the general person can get better at it? I've seen a bunch of links flying through, but is there from you to kind of like a go-to book link? Class better, they can just start learning, because I know there's specialists in this, but also it's good to create more generalists as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, if you want to start learning, I mean, anything written by Dave Farley usually is a good starting place. I think his books are well written, well thought out. Anton, you mentioned Accelerate. It's another great book, really more on the continuous delivery side. Yeah, those would be what I would start with.
Yeah, I'd say Accelerate for sure. That's kind of like the gold standard starting point. Absolutely.
Yeah, Brian Finster put in chat, watch Dave Farley's YouTube channel. Exactly right. He's got a ton of quick, easy videos you can pop on there, little bite-sized chunks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Somebody's raising their hand, but I can't see where, because it gives me an option to lower everyone's hand. So someone's hand's up. So if you're trying to come on screen, please lower your hand or raise it again, because I, for some reason, can't see you. But throw any other questions in the chat. We've got a few more minutes here to these fine gentlemen's time. I think you both talked about your companies, right? Make sure you've done that. Are you both going to be or have representatives at the industry day on Wednesday or Thursday? Excuse me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll be here on Thursday for sure.
Yeah, come on by and say hi. We can whiteboard some.
Fantastic. I love that. Here's a question from Sean. Any recommendations for getting developers to be more willing to adopt CI/CD practices? I feel most agree philosophically, but practically don't do.
Yeah, I think making it easy, right? Like how you ultimately build your pipeline, right, is going to determine how well it gets used, how often it gets used, right? And I think if you make it easy from a developer's perspective, if you have good connectivity into all those building blocks and all those kind of components, then ultimately you're going to have an easier time with CI/CD. If it's more cumbersome, then I think that's really where you start having culture issues, and people say, hey, I'm going to go about it my own way, or I'm going to try to string something together that works for me. That doesn't scale. That's not an approach that I think that most people would recommend at all. I certainly wouldn't, but that's usually what happens in those particular situations.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, developers like to stay in their tools, in their wheelhouse, in their IDE, in their integrated development environment. And the more that you can push to that, so they don't have to go log into something else, or I think that also helps with this, right? We were working on this project a few years ago at another company I was working with, and we could take all of this vulnerability data that usually the developers would get like in a spreadsheet, and we could actually push it back into their IDEs, tickets, where they could go knock down those vulnerabilities right from where they were. They didn't have to go into something else to do it. And we saw a massive increase in how quickly they would resolve vulnerabilities, but then how they got better over time about not presenting vulnerabilities into their applications. And again, I think a lot of it was the simplified experience, right? They could get everything in one place, not having to log into a bunch of different tools. That makes it a lot more attractive from what I've seen.
Excellent. Appreciate those answers on both of it. Save the best presentation for last. Thanks, Olivia. Once the dev sees the awesomeness of something like GitLab runners kickoff, they usually get hooked. Love it. Sean, there you go. Glad you used that. So yeah, if there's no more questions, oh, look at that. I'll let you guys take this one. Coming from Evan. Evan at the Navy account. So you did make it. I love that. Fantastic. Just give these gents a minute to read that because it's a longer one. And they can get that answered for you. While they're reading that, if you haven't got the link for Gather, there's some folks playing around in there. The big Gather day for Industry Day is going to be Thursday. But there's a few of us in and around there this afternoon after this session. You can say hi. Nothing official, just making sure everything works if you want to. But I'm going to pass it to you guys because you got questions coming in now.
Yeah, I think when you think of delivery to the edge, right, when you're talking to the edge and those are cloud connected devices, IoT devices, that I think that becomes a little easier to push and then get a response back to validate that has actually occurred. I will say that, shameless plug for CloudBees, like we actually, our continuous delivery release orchestration platform can actually be deployed across multiple air gap environments and basically pick up where that last job left off without having to do any call homes or send any data back out. So there are tools that do it. But it's definitely a little bit trickier. Zarf would be a way that you could start to look at helping move those Kubernetes environments across those different classification levels as well. But if you're just talking about software to the edge, yeah, I mean, there are tools out there. Hit me up afterwards, we can talk.
Yeah, likewise. I think, so for Harness, like we're all Kubernetes based. So wherever you have Kubernetes clusters, you can effectively run Harness, whether that's at the edge, or not, doesn't really matter. So again, agnostic in that way. We run fully containerized install with Helm. We're running from unclass all the way up to SAP TSSCI. So certainly able to accommodate that use case and similar use cases. But yeah, very, I would say lighter weight in that regard. So.
Yeah, and the next question is like, as far as like kind of the DOT&E, doing independent assessment of capability where you see those testers fitting in. I mean, I think that would be part of that kind of overall release process, right? And so you have your different kind of gates that occur as you're moving through the process, your automated tests are run. At certain points, once you know that those artifacts are deployable, I would think that that's at the point where you would have those testers be called in to either run their tools against it and or provide that manual oversight and then actually giving a pass, fail, grade based on that so that the pipeline can continue.
Excellent. Appreciate all that. Oh no, see, I come back on, they want to get rid of me. Every time I come on screen, they ask you more things or they talk about more things. Any comments there? And since I just remembered this is recorded and later, you can't see the comments that's on our program. We're trying to extract DT&E requirements and build in the CI/CD pipelines. There you go.
Yeah, I think I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. I think it's a little opaque, just at face value, but yeah, happy to dig into that one a little more. I think if you have
those defined, I think if they're defined and you know what the requirements for your DT&E are, then you would just add steps in the process to make sure it was collecting that body of evidence that you need to see as part of that, right? So those UAT testing results, those actual hands-on from your end users that are in there testing it. But I think there's a number of ways to incorporate it in. It just becomes a step in the overall process, or it pulls the data out of the pipeline. The pipeline provides it the information it needs to compare against what those requirements of the DT&E are.
Excellent, excellent. Appreciate the comments. Also, unless there's any other questions, and every time I say that, another one comes through, so here's a chance. These guys have got a couple more minutes, we'll give them. I did just throw a link in the chat. That is for Gather. Come talk to us. Not right now, ask your questions first. But in a few minutes, come join us. That's where Industry Day is going to be on Thursday. But we're over there right now and here a little bit to talk about, is there virtual beer? I mean, if I have a beer and you have a beer, then we can cheers. But there is, I think there is some Easter eggs around there, so you can't eat them. But if you walk around the space randomly, you may find some Easter eggs that get you some swag links or something else. And where are the waffles? Whipple Waffle's asking, I think Whipple Waffle. Say that 5 times fast. Gerald found a couple links. I love it. A couple announcements, but real quick, thanks, Bryan and Anton. You guys were awesome. Really appreciate you guys' time coming on here.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks for the opportunity.